Good evening, everyone. I know, everybody's so excited tonight. For some reason, it's really been great to see everybody. Thank you for joining us, both in person and by Zoom this evening. I'm Kate Markert. I'm Executive Director here at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens in Washington, D.C. We have a lot of people on Zoom, many of whom are not locals, so it's very exciting. My pronouns are she and her, and I always like to begin by gratefully acknowledging the Nacotchtank, who are also known as the Anacostan, the Piscataway, and the Pamunkey, and those are the native peoples on whose ancestral lands Hillwood stands, as well as, of course, the diverse and vibrant native communities who make their homes near here today. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, please make yourselves comfortable. Your cameras and microphones are not active. Submit questions via the Q&A function in the Zoom menu anytime as they cross your mind, and we will get to as many as we can from both locations at the end of the talk. For those of you in the theater, you know what I'm going to say. Make sure your devices are silenced. You don't want to be the one whose phone is ringing. Thank you for your cooperation. It was such a pleasure to be with so many of you at the reception upstairs for Hillwood members. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but there may be one or two of you who are not yet members, so I invite you to join today and take advantage of all of our member benefits, as I know our members have been doing. Discounts on programs like this, and in the shop most especially, and of course in the cafe. Many of you know that Hillwood founder Marjorie Merriweather Post resided at Hillwood only in the spring and the fall, and of course there are reasons for that, as I'm sure those of you who live here know full well. Fall, though, of course, is truly fabulous at Hillwood. We have thousands upon thousands of mums that are, all in bloom now, you can see, and pansies and all sorts of other, kale, beautiful fall arrangements. And I hope that some of you who are in the DC region will join our greenhouse grower, Jarrett Curran, and learn about the 50 different types of chrysanthemums that we grow, because he'll take you through the production greenhouse, and it is really something to see. They're short tours. They will be offered on Wednesdays and Fridays through November 4th. I hope to connect with all of you next week. Next week is strictly by Zoom, Tuesday, October 18th, as the Grace of Monaco lecture series continues. Next week, we'll share a conversation between Hillwood curator Megan Martinelli and the exhibition's originating curator, Florence Mueller. And then on October 25th, we come back to the hybrid format, connecting those of you at Hillwood and also live streamed to those at home. Darnell Jamal Lisby will share the story of Jay Jackson, and he was one of the first African Americans to work in Parisian haute couture, and he got his start at Christian Dior under artistic director Mark Bohan. And of course, you can learn about all of these programs and a lot more at hillwoodmuseum.org. It's now my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Alexandra Palmer is the Nora E. Vaughan Senior Curator of Global Fashion and Textiles at the Royal Ontario Museum. She's responsible for the collection of 44,000 fashions and textiles from Europe and North America. She teaches and is affiliated faculty in art history at the University of Toronto. She has curated many exhibitions, including Dior 1947 to 1957. She co-curated for Unmasking the Pandemic as well as the International Committee of Museums' virtual exhibition, Clothing the Pandemic. We do have opportunity to ask her about those at the end of the lecture. Dr. Palmer has written 3 award-winning publications: Christian Dior, History and Modernity, 1947 to 1957, Christian Dior, A New Look, A New Enterprise, 1947 to 1957, and Couture and Commerce, The Transatlantic Fashion Trade in the 1950s. Her forthcoming collaborative book, A Case Study on Patterns of Fashion, will be published by the School of Historical Dress in London. She has contributed to international museum catalogs, including Gabrielle Chanel, Fashion Manifesto, Les Années 50, Cloth That Changed the World, The Chanel Legend, and The Golden Age, Haute Couture, 1947 to 1957. Please join me in welcoming Alexandra.
Good evening, everyone, and it is absolutely my pleasure to be here. This is my first time at Hillwood, and I'm very excited, and I've had a wonderful day seeing your wonderful collection and the garden, and I haven't seen all those mums yet. Sorry, this isn't working. Okay, thank you. I'm just going to... Okay, great. All right, now we're set. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about Monsieur Dior, who, as you know, was important for Princess Grace of Monaco, as the exhibition here explains. So I'm going to look earlier at the phenomenon of the creation and success of the house to understand how and why the designs and the designer had such an enormous impact on post-war fashion. Christian Dior designs from the opening of the house in 1957 to now were de rigueur for elegant women such as Princess Grace and all his Dior clients. His fashions gave authority and signified impeccable style and appropriate taste that was unequivocal. When Monsieur Dior burst upon the Paris fashion scene on February 12th, 1947, 17 months after the end of the Second World War, he created a fashion revolution. Carmel Snow, who was the editor of Harper's Bazaar in America, dubbed it a new look, hence the name. The new look was based on Dior's fully formed and unified fashion direction that captured the zeitgeist of the moment. The press commented on the way the models walked, the new hairstyles, the hats, the colored stockings that matched the dresses and shoes, and the perfect accessories. It was a whole look as well. It was such a complete look that it even included perfume that was sprayed throughout the house at the time. It was just unbelievable what people were experiencing in that salon. The new look swept away the hard chic of wartime style, of masculine padded shoulders and slim knee-length skirts, think of Lauren Bacall, and replaced it with an ultra-feminine silhouette that accentuated the bosom, waist, and hips and featured soft, rounded shoulders and long, full skirts. Dior said it was, quote, the look of peace, it reflects the time. In 1953, Women's Wear Daily explained that Dior had wanted to elevate standards of good taste internationally, using the Paris Designing Center as a laboratory of fashion ideas. He hopes ultimately to spread the results of such ideas over the world, and he did. The war had devastated Europe and sent into motion international restrictions on textile productions and use that were directed to the war effort, to uniforms, bandages, hospital supplies, all sorts of things that people needed. In September 1938, the Canadian Wartime Prices and Trade Board introduced rationing of textiles that changed fashion design. The UK, in June 1941, under Sir Stafford Cripps, president of the Board of Trade and a so-called austerity expert, urged designers to compromise with hemlines at mid-calf specifying 14 inches from the ground for women, and cabinet ministers declared that they liked to see a shapely feminine leg. Well, they would know. Clothing in 1942 was rationed on a point system under the utility clothing scheme that restricted buttons, pockets, and pleats. And it was part of the whole rationing effort that went on actually until the early 50s in England. America introduced the L85 order in March 1943 that limited the use of lengths, widths, and wools for winter uniforms and blankets, and offered alternatives such as rayon, knitting, blends, recycled wool, and silk, all these things which were important for the armed forces. Paris had been occupied and French industries ruined by the war. Christian Dior had experienced all. He'd worked at the House of Piguet, and he'd worked also with Lucien Lelon, who was the couturier who was negotiating with the Germans when they occupied Paris, and the Germans had wanted to move the Paris couture to Berlin, and he's the one that negotiated keeping it in Paris. So Dior had been listening and really learned about all this stuff. And Dior declared that wartime fashions were one of the ugliest ever seen. His new vision adopted new ways of thinking about dressing and making fashion that had historical and many French precedents. He wanted to reinstate Paris as the epicenter of fashion design, as supposedly it had been since the 18th century. He wanted to make people come back, buyers, manufacturers, the elite, who had done without Paris when Paris was occupied, so we have to get them back. He wanted to revive the skills of Paris haute couture and all the ancillary trades, the beads, people who make the beads, the beaders, the embroidery houses, textile weaving, printing, everything, button making, so many industries. He wanted to attract the most fashionable and best dressed women in the world, and his idea was to have a small couture house, which that didn't work out for him. But what was it that was so new about the new look, and what was the appeal? Dior's new look woman was desired by both sexes around the world, and she came in two guises. An historically based, archly chic, sophisticated and sexually aware female that fueled male desires and fantasies. She was a pin-up girl, a cocotte. The other Dior woman was a sweet ingenue, the coquette, who represented youth. She was linked to new technology, also I think in some ways an American way of life, and promised a good, safe, and modern future. The extraordinary artistry of Dior was that he tapped into both of these ideals simultaneously, and he managed to commodify his look in so many ways for so many women around the globe. Princess Grace interestingly fused both of these ideals, I think, and made a perfect partnership for Dior and Marc Bohan. The business of Christian Dior was immediately extremely profitable. Dior influenced women around the world through his ready-to-wear lines. Christian Dior New York in 1948, Christian Dior London in 1942. He had licensing agreements with stores and global producers, as well as selling rights for copies and reproductions, which was huge for Paris. And it meant that people had to come to Paris to buy the clothes. And of course, they also went to other couture houses. The company developed its own innovating licensing program and policies so that Dior controlled the production, distribution, and marketing worldwide and received a commission from all its licensees on all sales. This seems normal now, but it wasn't. It was revolutionary, and he followed, particularly for a European, an American model, but he controlled it, even in Japan. And he opened a grand boutique in 1955, which allowed you to buy something from Dior, whether it was lipstick or tableware, and in fact, this Le Grand is still in production today. 6 years after opening, Dior included 8 companies, 16 associated enterprises across 5 continents. It was a phenomenal growth that made the House of Christian Dior account for more than half the total export of haute couture and 5% of all French exports. He was a household name, and he was very good at marketing. But money alone did not make the house the success it has been for over 75 years. Dior wrote, quote, The new look was a success only because it reflected a mood that sought refuge from the mechanical, the impersonal, in a return to tradition. So what was it about the actual clothes like this? And today I saw in your lovely museum a portrait of Empress Eugenie, and I wish I had that next to this because there's lots of similarities in the dress. So go look at that portrait again. What was it about the clothes? Why and how, in only 22 collections from the founding of the house in 1947 until his death in 1957, did millions of women around the world wear fashions influenced by Monsieur Dior? His reimagining of the female form was an extreme vision, a historical amalgam that filtered classical ideas through contemporary art and the modern culture of Dior's own time to imagine a post-war future. He consciously echoed the great moments of French design and cultural superiority. He was a nationalist. It was very important to him that Paris and France was a center for fashion. He was indebted to the styles of the 18th century, as this dress Palmer so well shows, and so well represented here at Hillwood and appreciated by Mrs. Post. He evoked the splendor and large crinolines of the Second Empire, another pinnacle of French culture and society, to create a new post-war French Republic, he hoped, a new time for industrial expansion, building profits in France. He looked at historical dress construction and revived many 19th century methods. With the skilled cutters and hands in his atelier, he developed a fashion construction and ways of thinking about dressing that modernized historic ideas. 19th century dresses had boned bodices, even though they were worn over boned corsets, so you're very not going anywhere wearing that stuff. A typical mid-19th century ensemble had one voluminous skirt that required many lengths of expensive textile. The cost was in the textile, not in the name. There was no name associated with this. And multiple bodices that needed far less textile but more expertise for fitting. The two bodices allowed for flexible wear and greater economy from an ensemble that could be worn for with the same skirt for day or evening. Dior reworked this idea, adopting modern ways of thinking about dressing, such as this design audacieuse that has two bodices, one for late afternoon and one for evening, and it's worn over the same understructure. The ensemble soubrette was made of 3 garments that could be worn 4 ways. Dior's approach was in step with modern American sportswear that had component parts for varied wear on multiple occasions, and there's several dresses of his that you can have this sort of transformational effect going on. Here we go. So Dior's reimagined the feminine. The clothes were nostalgic and romantic, recalling a past that was psychologically comfortable. It belonged to mothers and grandmothers in corseted bodices and long skirts, a time when women ran the domestic sphere and did not work in munition factories. One private client explained the delight of the clothes only 10 days after Dior's first showing. She said, and this is Mitford, "We are saved, becoming clothes are back, gone the stern padded shoulders, in our soft rounded shoulders without padding, nipped in waist, wide skirts, about 4 inches below the knee." So Dior's immediate success with the new look reverberated throughout the industry, but also encountered international backlash from outraged women and men. In the aftermath of post-war shortages and austerity, the most shocking aspect was the sheer amount of fabric required. And as you've seen, of course, Paris didn't have restrictions because they didn't have anything, and they were invaded, and Europe was devastated. But England had done their thing, Canada and US, so people were pretty outraged that now all their clothes were obsolete, and Monsieur Dior, this Frenchman, was telling them they had to change everything. Women were not immediately resigned to write off their existing wardrobes as obsolete. You can't make a new look skirt from an old look skirt. It doesn't work. There's not enough fabric. They organized, saying the new length was, quote, awkward, impractical, and especially unattractive to men. Wardrobe replacement is outrageously expensive. In the United States, women signed a petition protesting a return to 1920s fashion, saying they could not afford to discard their wardrobes for the outlandish new styles. They were joined by members of the Little Below the Knee Club who said, "Why should women go backward in styles? They aren't going backward in anything else." The Canadian medical community weighed in, claiming that fashion was injurious to health as a waspy waistline could provoke varicose veins, and longer skirts put strain on leg muscles leading to backache. So now you know. Long dresses were said to be hazardous on modern transit, and they imprisoned mothers' and daughters' legs. So everyone has an opinion about fashion, as we know. Another worrying factor was that long skirts might be a harbinger of an economic turndown, as the last time hemlines dramatically dropped was in 1929, the same year as the Wall Street crash. This is very serious. And Dr. Paul Nystrom, an economics professor at Columbia University, in his 1928 scientific and male authoritative explanation of the female fashion system, had cautioned against dropping hemlines and proved it by diagrams. There was a requiem for the famed legs of Marlene Dietrich, who wore the new look, though it was pointed out that she shrewdly favored Dior's hemline that was shorter in the front. We will see later that Dior and Marlene made up for her legs in other departments. The reality was that dress manufacturers were required to rethink patterns, yardage, and prices, and they struggled to make the new look patterns on existing old dress forms. More fabric meant more labor and electricity, making clothing prices more expensive. It was a huge shift for industry and ultimately bolstered post-war recovery. Of course, immediately what happened is that every dress manufacturer's dresses were out of date, so they had to dump everything. So it really was such a dramatic shift, which is why kind of Dior watching throughout the whole 50s became so important, because nobody wanted to be in that position again of being not with it financially. The new look looked and also felt different. It hugged the body, had soft shoulders and fitted sleeves, a marked difference from wartime. Dior transformed a traditional day suit that did the opposite of clothing regulations that specified no cloth on cloth and had no special function in relation to serviceability, and extra cloth was deemed a needless, extravagant use of material. So this suit is the antithesis of wartime styling, and this is a suit that really kind of got me going about really looking at the clothes in detail. It's called Zigomar, and it's from one of his early collections. The sleeve jackets envelop the woman, and they're actually cut on the bias. The jacket is an homage to pockets and classic tailoring techniques that celebrate this use of cloth and cloth that the Canadian Wartime Prices and Trade Board said, do not go there. The double front extends into non-functional shoulder pockets with large flaps that are purely a design feature. In fact, Zigomar experiments with 3 kinds of pockets, each requiring different techniques for finishing, completely different tailoring techniques, all difficult. The vertical jetted pockets in the peplum are functional and create important style lines. You can see how it's completely integrated there, and it doesn't go, it's not extended into the bottom of the jacket. There's no dart there. There's no seam. And the skirt has 2 vertical pockets inset in the seams of the narrow front panel that are emphasized with welt finishing, another kind of technique. This design requires time, imagination, and expertise to realize successfully, and signifies and exemplifies the luxury of real haute couture. These pockets you won't even see under the jacket. It was the sort of garment manufacturers studied closely to try to understand how to achieve the new look, and it offered a plethora of design ideas. The new look began with Dior's wasp-cinched and tight corsets, which were vital for strapless designs. The centuries-old use of a corseted female torso had not been in the vocabulary of high fashion for over 30 years. The 20s and 30s fashions did not use corsets, they were out, or boning, and relied on new technology on elastics and the bias cut. During the war, all such materials were consigned to the war effort, so there really wasn't anything. You just had to make do, and everyone was starving and thin anyway. The Dior corset sculpted the torso and raised the rounded breast so that any wearer could take on the desired Dior shape. But corset mating had to be revived. Dior's corset was the basis of many of his models. And this is a 19th century corset you can see that he's copying. Dior said, "I wanted my dresses to be constructed like buildings, molded to the curves of the female form, stylizing its shape. And his designs can be compared to the modernist towers that rose elegantly into the post-war landscape, with soaring glass facades invisibly supported with reinforced steel and concrete structure beneath." Dior's corsets and cinched-in waist was exaggerated with large skirts, supported by petticoats. Now, petticoats were an undergarment that had also gone away, that had not been seen in fashion since the early 20th century, and they made a swift resurgence. And with them, the new look carried a new sound, so that one magazine wrote, quote, "The rustle of ruffles was heard throughout the land." This was significant because after the war, the freedom to make a noise that heralded your arrival must have been exhilarating. Excessive yardage in full skirts had a luxurious, sensuous weight and moved fluidly over the hips and down to the calves when a woman walked, then pooled around her when she sat or bent. Christian Dior's dresses emphasized this. This 1948 evening dress called Isabelle took enormous amounts of textiles. That really is quite staggering. It required around 14 yards of the striped silk. These patterns are by my colleague Berta Pavlov. Another 12 yards for the self-lining because the skirt was made of 2 complete circles. The pink sash required an additional 7.5 yards. It weighs 8.5 pounds, but looks effortless when worn and must have felt dramatically different from wartime clothes. It was a romantic late 19th century style. Christian Dior wrote about this saying, "Dresses took up a fantastic yardage. Girls could safely feel they had all the trappings of a fairy tale princess. The war was over. What did the weight of my sumptuous materials, my heavy velvets and brocades matter? When hearts were light, mere fabrics could not weigh the body down." End quote. 2, Monsieur Dior's décolletage were as risqué and dramatic as those worn by sophisticated socialites at the fin de siècle, 60 years before, and immortalized in paintings by Baldini or John Singer Sargent, and epitomized by maybe the scandalous Madame X portrait shown in the 1884 Paris Salon. From his first collection to his last, Dior necklines were known to be risqué and were the most extreme of the season. Dior responded to journalists' queries when they asked why. He said, "You have them, so why should you be ashamed of them?" And on the alarming question of how low was too low, replied, "Low and as wide as the law permits. Low enough to be attractive, but not low enough to be indecent." So this design, Pompelune from the second collection, really shows the experimentation and innovation of cut and workmanship stemming from the Dior ateliers in this deceptively looking little black dress, a day dress. So Dior said, little wool dresses, casual or sports models, are very often involve the greatest sacrifices. One can hardly ask a price for them, yet making them, particularly when they are pleated, is one of the most laborious of our tasks. So here you can see it on one of his mannequins, as shown in his salon. And this is a pattern of the actual design, which I'll explain later. But as you can see, again, it takes a phenomenal amount of material and time. The bodice front Back yoke and sleeves are all cut in one piece of cloth that ends up on the bias over the shoulder. And this is what he really worked on to make this new look, making a smooth and fitted look. The skirt is made from a basic rectangle, actually good zero waist technique, cut into 33 narrow strips that are 1 inch wide from hem to hip. And each are inset with 33 godets, each made from 2 pieces. This makes 99 seams in the skirt alone, hand done. And when Berta was doing this pattern, we went back and forth. She said, it can't be made like this because there's no seam allowance. And I said, I don't think there is. And there isn't. You just have to be really impeccable in sewing. But out of one design, such as Pampelune, a copyist could take many new ideas and make a small fortune from the rich design resources. Dior's taste was highly consistent, and he worked on such cuts like these for years. The bound buttonholes on the back of Pampelune ends up in a distinctive and technically complex placket detail that is repeated with 15 collections and 8 years later as a center front detail in another design, Invitation. It explains why manufacturers had to buy and had to have in hand Christian Dior's designs that were such a goldmine of ideas, for hundreds of designs. So if you're an American manufacturer, you can really spin off a lot of things from one design. In 1944, fashion journalists predicted the fashion of the future in 10 years, a favorite exercise for fashion people. And that in 1955, fashions would be labor-saving, and that women would not go back to, quote, aimless leisure, whatever that is, and dressing would be accomplished in minutes rather than hours. The new look did none of this. The new look changed the act of dressing. So why did women accept crinolines and corsets, long skirts, hooks and eyes that required assistance to dress when they had worn trousers, been paid, driven trucks, and made munitions during the war? This really irritated me about Dior. Dior said, fashion is feeling, it cannot be reasoned. The silhouette was undeniably feminine, and the new cuts resulted in new sensations, making women feel feminine. Wearing a new look style was a new physical experience that was very different. It was a clear symbol that the war was over and there would be someone there to assist you to dress, as Carol Rapp, who wore Venezuela, recalled. And that was the dress before. She said, I needed help to do all of the hooks and snaps. Putting it on was a production. In the 1950s, getting ready for an evening out wasn't running a brush through my hair. It was a whole ritual that took up the better part of the afternoon. Hair, nails, makeup, often squeezing into specially shaped undergarments if they weren't already built into the dress, stockings with garter belts, then the dress, and hopefully a martini along the way. Dior said, I'm in the business of ideas. He loved fashion, art, and culture, and he understood these worlds in complex ways. He had worked for Paquin and Lelon as two of those the small little early designs worked for, and this was his famous, the one bar that was sort of the epitome of the new look, and what Carmel Snow dubbed it. But these designs are still at the heart of the house for nearly over 2 decades. The traces of the original designer and the threads of each subsequent designer has built on all these tropes that he set up within from 1947 to 1957, and you see them consistently. So Marc Bohan designed for Christian Dior London and then became the head designer, and you can see that he here had a go at bar, which is almost like a rite of passage for the designers there. Gianfranco Ferré did it, John Galliano, and now for the first time, a female designer, Maria Grazia Chiuri, has interpreted the house for today. So it just keeps going on. Christian Dior garments are microcosms of the complex world of Paris haute couture that permeated women's Western fashion in the post-war years. Dior and his ateliers invented modern dressmaking and demonstrated, as one author wrote, that, quote, dressmakers are the last enchanters to have magic power to make women's dreams come true. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. That was a wonderful presentation. Before we move into the question and answer period, I just want to let everybody know where this voice is coming from. My name is Erin Lurie, and I work with our adult programs here at Hillwood. I have the privilege of being the voice of our Zoom audience this evening. We are going to transition and take questions for a while. For those of you who are here in Hillwood's Theater, my colleague Alex will be running around a wireless microphone. Please wait until you get the microphone to begin asking your questions, because the Zoom audience will not be able to hear you, even if you're speaking very, very loudly. So Alex will be out there running the microphone. I'm going to kick us off with one of the questions from our Zoom audience. Caroline McDonald just asked if there's a place where the recreated pattern pieces can be seen. She's a fashion design student and would love to be able to look at them more clearly.
Thank you. The patterns that I showed are in my book, which is called Christian Dior, History and Modernity. Unfortunately, it's out of print now, but libraries should have it, and I believe there might even be a copy here. And those were all done by Berta Pavlov.
Questions from the audience?
We've got another question from Zoom. Madeline asked if you could share more about that final quotation about making women's dreams come true, particularly wondering where that came from and where she can learn more.
I don't have it in my, I don't have my footnotes with me now, so, but it was, the thing about Christian Dior, I think, in this, the whole new look, was that what he set out to do was really revolutionary. There were other designers in Paris also working with similar ideas before, but what Dior managed to do was, A, he was backed by Marcel Boussac, who was one of the richest men in France, so he had incredible financial power behind him. He was established at the post-war, so he wasn't bringing an old house, old ideas, any preconceived ideas with him. He was starting from scratch. So he just went kind of pow with all these ideas, and that were perfectly put together. And I think that when you read the reports of journalists coming back to Paris, they talk about the tattered couture houses, and France was devastated, and they were horrified, particularly the Americans, when they came back and saw this, the journalists. They were appalled at how shabby everything looked, and kind of depressing, and Dior had fresh paint. It was all put together. It was all planned. So he had money behind him, and he wasn't recreating any old baggage or trying to convince someone that he was still important, because even though the war had gone on, he was just completely new. So he had this profound impact, and he really took it upon himself to represent Paris, to represent all of haute couture after the war, and to bring all those people back, not only for him, but for all the Paris industries. And you can't have haute couture if you don't have textile manufacturers, if you don't have people with great design ideas, if you don't have the amazing button selection, if you don't have the ribbons, and all those things he was very, very cognizant of, and consciously designed his collection so that there was a dress for the ribbon maker, there was a lace dress for the person who was making the lace, so that he supported all these industries who needed those designers to do stuff, and he was very good at that, and so he really was an ambassador for the house as well. And then he, with the money from Marcel Boussac and Monsieur Ruette, who was really the business brains behind the licenses and everything, setting the house up to be able to expand and to be able to control their licenses and have this a real design over the brand. There was a story about, and they had spies everywhere who were checking on things, and if you're a licensee and there's all these notes back to Paris of what people are doing, and you better behave yourself, otherwise your license is going to be revoked. And then very plaintive letters from people saying, oh, I didn't know that he stole the handbag design, but please, I really need to be in charge of your handbags. But there was something when Dior stockings went on sale in a department store in America, and they were horrified because Christian Dior stockings did not go on sale. So they sent someone in and they just bought all the stockings so they wouldn't be on sale. So, I mean, they're really active about it. So.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you very much. That was an awesome presentation. You know, the that dress that had the 99 pieces really caught my attention. And I just wanted to make sure if I understood, if I heard correctly, were those hand sewn?
Yes, the question was about the dress Pompaloon with the 99 bits in it. The little black day dress that you're never going to make money on. Yes, it was all those things have to be hand sewn. You can't get in there with a sewing machine, and also because it goes to a point, like two triangles go together to a point, are inserted. It can look, if you try, it can look really bad really easily.
It will not look nice.
You have to, and it's a kind of crepe, so it has some kind of elasticity. It's just a technical feat. I mean, it's really like, the Olympics of dressmaking.
Yes. And are you aware whether they had one person, the same person sewing that, or did they have several people?
Well, they had within the couture atelier, there's two ateliers. There's the fleu, which is dressmaking and things that fly out of your hand, and then there's tailoring, which is wool and things that are obviously more tailored, which are two different kinds of techniques. So, and within that, there's a real hierarchy of who's given the dress, the first hand, who's in charge of that dress that's made for a specific mannequin, a model. So it made to fit her, and she's the women in the dresses. Those are the people that dress is made for. They're the ones that show the dress in the salon, which was shown every day to private clients. And then within them, and they're given the sketch, and they're the ones that have to sort of work out how to translate the croquis into a physical three-dimensional garment with the main people who supervise the ateliers. And then underneath them, there's people who have different skills and are good at different things. And then the petit main, the young apprentices, and there's a whole apprentice system that they go through with exams, are the ones that are kind of picking up pins and doing basting and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, you can see it can go pretty fast if you know what you're doing. But the technical working out of the patterns is what is really so brilliant, and it's also very economical. It's a real respect for the textile. So they're the way they lay the cloth out is very respectful of kind of less waste and stuff like that, and using things like selvages, the edge of the material that's a natural edge that doesn't fray, for like a zipper or something. So you don't need to have an extra binding, you don't need to have extra sewing in there, not to save time, but to prevent bulk. So that you have these, everything is so worked out and planned so that you really look fabulous. And
I believe that.
It all goes together. And it's, this is why couture is couture, and women who've worn couture dresses, the inside is magical. you put it on, and Dior, with his corsets and everything, I mean, you put it on and you look like a Dior, and the corset was underneath, and then the neckline just kind of floated across you. So you were framed like you were in a painting. Nothing was kind of, you were always within the dress. You were always you. I mean, it really is, and nothing was ironed down. That was folded and gentle and really beautiful.
Fascinating. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I was just wondering how many copies of each dress would have been made?
The question was how many copies of each dress would be made. It would depend on the dress. Now, the Americans called it a Ford, which was actually the Chanel little black dress in the 20s when she made that, and it became called a Ford, and that's where that came from. And a Ford was a runner, like it came off the production shop, and you could make lots of money off a Ford, right? So what happened is that the collections were shown, this is in the 50s, the collections were shown in Paris, and first to see them were the fashion press, the buyers with the most money, like the American department stores, and the big buyers. And then there was a hierarchy of who was shown next for basically a week of international buyers, and which included manufacturers, and you had to pay a caution, you had to pay a fee to get into the house, and whatever you bought was deducted from that fee. So it was an encouragement for you to actually purchase something, not just look. And then also Dior was really phobic about copying, because these designs are copyrighted in France. Like Couture was copyrighted as a design, which is always a sort of a huge, big, impossible quagmire. And Dior was very good at pursuing people who copied. And there was a whole system of pirating designs and stealing and everything. That's actually one of my favorite chapters in one of my book I wrote about Dior, was the sort of nefarious things that went on in the design house. So then they would see it, but then the press was told they couldn't publish anything about it until later on in the season, but then they would know, because if a design sold like 10 copies or 20 copies, and this is in the book that's for sale upstairs, I talk about this a lot, and I did a lot of this analysis, because the archives in Paris, they actually have these business records, which is really exceptional. And so, if something sold like 20, 40 copies, that was a lot. And also the house had to then get all the textiles, everyone, and that same team of people who made that dress to remake it so many times so it could all be delivered to those people at the same time, because the timing of everything was crucial, because once the design was out, it was basically stolen, knocked off, copied, and then when it came on the Couture plane to North America, to New York, and there was a Couture plane where all the Paris Couture designs arrived to customs. Customs official were the first people to see the Paris designs, which is really funny, because they were the ones who would tax it, like they know. And so then the manufacturers and everyone had to pay duty on it, and then they just rushed this clothes up to 7th Avenue, and they had everyone lined up to, get the really good copies out at Bergdorf's or something. There were high-end copies, and then the lower-end copies, and then it kind of filtered down like to 34th Street and 14th Street and in Manhattan. So it really was this kind of race against time. So, but out of, if a design sold, more than 10 copies, that was a lot for Paris. But then, because they knew which were the Fords, because, if you sell this design, it's going to be on everyone's back everywhere. So then when the private clients come in, they say, no, madam, I don't think you should buy this one, So they're buying the clothes that are not going, they're telling them, they're helping their clients who are really buying the real stuff and wearing it. So they're not going to be, showing up with something with some Macy's, $10 version next to them somewhere. So it's this really interesting system of how to kind of control design ideas, which is really impossible now, particularly with the internet, but was really difficult even then with, telegrams, all this stuff, different kinds of technology, but people have always been good at that. Even, Monsieur Worth in the end of the 19th century had the same difficulties. Poiret, all the design, it's a perennial problem.
I'm going to interject with a related question from our Zoom audience. You've touched on this a little bit with the copies and particularly the licensing, but we did get a question about how Dior's designs influenced the clothing of the working class.
How did his clothes influence the designs of the working class? Well, I don't know about the working class, but certainly, generally speaking, just skirt lengths, petticoats, which, they didn't have fast fashion, but there was North America, particularly the US, was really good at ready-to-wear. There wasn't that kind of ready-to-wear. Ready-to-wear didn't really exist in Europe in the same way that it did here. So this very fast production, America was set up for production of fashion and mass production and ready-to-wear in a way that Europe wasn't, because they just did it an old way because they were an older culture. So it certainly was influenced in terms of style, and circulation of ideas was everywhere. There was that book I showed of his, Christian Dior wrote only in English, of, how to dress Christian Dior. And he talks about how you don't need money, you just need taste, wherever you get that from. And, know how. So he's constantly giving fashion tips so that so that you don't have to actually have a Dior, you don't have to be rich and buy couture. He was very interested in women being well dressed, properly groomed, and tasteful in his very French way. So, having the right color schemes, and so all the what we have now in fast fashion didn't exist, but people could make patterns, they could see things, they could copy. So definitely the skirt length, some kind of cinched in waist, all those things permeated throughout the Western fashion system. And if you had a new look skirt, all of a sudden, if you put the coat over it, then the coat's too short and it looks bad. I mean, this is the problem with fashion. We've all had this experience where, even with mini, maxi, all that stuff. So, this was always the concern. So there was so much fashion writing and journalism and trying to tease out what the future is of fashion always, which is why it's really irritating. And it's really irritating for men, and it's really irritating for those who hold the purse strings, which traditionally has been men in large manufacturing industries, to try and understand what it is that's going to happen and why it has to change and what's going to, how are they going to be left with the good stuff or not the good stuff. So this huge concern, because it's such an economic driver across so many industries. I mean, it really matters. So this kind of prediction of the future and incredible focus on Dior in the post-war world was because all of a sudden fashion had changed and no one wanted to be, on the wrong side of that again. Which of course happened with the mini and the midi. That was another big scandal, right? All those things. It never stops.
I think we had a question in the third row. Yes, I was just curious, in terms of price point, back during those years, what would some of those dresses run?
Well, they
Price
were,
range.
yeah, I mean, they were a couple of $100s. It would depend on the dress. And again, I talk about that. The question is about the price of the dresses at the time. Relatively, and actually in my first book, Couture and Commerce, I wrote on what percentage of the kind of family wardrobe was spent. But one thing is, women didn't have as many clothes as they have today by any stretch of the imagination. So that was different. And it was a a different attitude about being wearing the dress for a long time, and it was very normal for, if you were a couture client, to take your clothes back to the couture house and have them adjusted for you, because maybe your shape had changed or maybe fashion had changed a bit. And so they have nice big seam allowances, knowing that's, respectful of the client for that. And they talk about that with Balenciaga too. Bettina Ballard, who was a fashion reporter for Vogue, showed up with a 10-year-old Balenciaga to Balenciaga, and it's like, okay, all right, we'll keep it going. Which is what we need to do now in terms of being sustainable. But they were expensive, and they were for the elite, and so the money for couture houses was not made out of private clients. Private clients were sort of like the race horses who showed off the clothes the best. But the money was made through the manufacturers, who paid big money to do that, and the licensing agreements and those numbers, as well as toiles and all the stuff. But also for if a good copy would be made out of the same material, for instance, that the Dior dress was made in. So they go to the manufacturer and get that, and they get the same buttons and stuff like that. So it permeated throughout the whole industry. Or they'd take it to America and get a cheaper American material, which didn't have to pay import duties. Duty was a big thing. Duty was a big concern. And that was on zippers, buttons, embroideries, belts. It was a really complicated way they taxed things that shot the prices up. And there was a system, actually, of so-called bonded models where they would, now I'm really getting into it, where they would, America allowed things to come into bond in the US for 6 months without paying duty if they were exported out, so that they could bring in couture clothes, copy them, look at them, show them in the salon at Bergdorf Goodman's or whatever, and then get them out of the country without paying duty. So actually us Canadians profited very well from that. And we have lots of bonded models in our collection.
Where did most of the fabrics come from?
For the Paris couture, yes. Where did most of the fabrics come from? There was a system the French had where you could get a subsidy for your couture house if I think it was 40% of the fabric was French. I mean, very kind of Colbert 18th, 17th century ideas here. Champagne can only be from Champagne. Well, Paris couture, haute couture can only be from Paris, from one of these haute couture houses that is accredited as such and has been through a review process that was annual. And so obviously they wanted to sustain their own industries, as well as, British wools, Italian silks as well, printing industries. There was a lot. Staron was really big. Asher was a British firm that did stuff for Dior. So, they go anywhere where there were great artists and great designers, and the textile industries were creating designs hoping that the couturiers would buy their products, right? So it's this very symbiotic, complicated relationship. The same with the person who's making sequins, designing sequins. That's like an amazing thing. And then the beader, who's an embroidery house, who's proposing patterns and proposing designs with these certain embroideries that they're hoping to reproduce. So, it's this whole kind of rainbow that goes down and supports this really fantastic, based on, when you go to Paris, still there's, areas that just have sort of metal fittings. It's a very old European, basically medieval guild system in a way that's, come out to what it is today. So amazing skills.
Thank you. We have a question right here.
I was really interested in something that you mentioned, which was during the Second World War, women were much more autonomous, much more independent. They were holding down jobs. Obviously, this was a certain class of women. And that this dress really represents something that is kind of sending them back to more traditional gender roles, which are much more confining. And you can see it kind of trickled down into the poodle skirts of the teeny boppers later on.
Exactly, yeah.
And so I am interested to know more about how the role this fashion played in these larger, social, political, economical trends, which were really closing down the gender kind of freedoms that had existed during World War II and making gender identity much more rigid in the 50s.
So I'll repeat that question short and tell me if I'm right. The question is, how did the fashion affect or cement new gender roles? Is that a good way of putting it? So when I have worked on Dior, everyone always mentioned Dior when I was working on Couture, and I was more interested in other couturiers than Christian Dior because there's more written on Dior than any other couturier, and a lot of it written by Dior as well. And there's lots of fabulous other couturiers that there's no information on, and it's like, well, I want to know about these guys. And so Dior sort of kept getting in my way, and then I had to actually deal with him when I did the first book on him. And this, like, why did women go for this? Exactly was kind of one of my big questions. But I think, all those things I've said about it being safe, it being completely feminine, reviving, old ideas after a really terrible time. People had had a horrible, horrible time during the war. It was not safe. So this idea, and women had done a lot of work. Women were working, and they had to step aside when the men came back and their, the forces, and it was all programmed by the government too, so that women's job was to get in the house and have babies, and, the whole sort of 50s suburbs, all that stuff, and the suburbs were designed to diversify America so that there wasn't a center, so one center couldn't be bombed, and all this network of roads and everything was to distribute the wealth and to keep it safe. So everything was geared towards this new post-war thinking about growth, and about, with the Marshall Plan helping them overseas, to spur up industry and to sort of recover what they felt was lost, and to have new technology, nylon, and all these amazing new synthetics that were developed after the war in terms of textiles. And women did go into the workplace. They were secretaries, they did other things, which of course they'd done since the late 19th century too. But, when women got the vote is an interesting thing to look at across the board. Nobody wants to be in this terrible state, that countries still are today, in wartime. I mean, you want to have a simpler, nicer family life. And I think his dresses really, epitomize that, and this kind of post-war economy and ethos for doing that. Obviously, not everyone 100% went wrong. You get Rosie the Riveter, and then you get, Mrs. Whatever in her apron in the fabulous, suburban home with all the matching appliances. I mean, it's all driven to resuscitate the economy, and but people aren't stupid. People, if there's a design or an idea that's made and people don't go along with it, it's not going to work. So there has to be an ethos and an agreement, however tacit it is, that this is the way forward, I think. So this idea of Dior being a kind of dictator and telling women what to wear and shoving them back into corsets is, women aren't going to, it's going to be a flop if there's something that's not appropriate for the moment that people go along with. So, and that, it's what that is. That's the sort of fiber of fashion that everyone wants to know, because then you can make $1 million. And, he got it right, so.
We have time for just one last question, and I'm going to turn that over to our Zoom audience, in part because I know you had the opportunity to tour Grace of Monaco, Princess in Dior with Megan earlier today. And we got a couple of questions about if you could speak to either your favorite piece or something that struck you particularly in the exhibition.
Yes, the question about your exhibition here on Princess Grace. What was really interesting for me actually was being in Hillwood, and as I've said, that portrait of Empress Eugenie and the dress that Dior did using a million ribbons so he could help the ribbon manufacturer. And then in that exhibition, the dress Pampelune, the one with the zillions of gauze that's impossible to make, the little black dress you don't want to make. There's a dress in the exhibition that is a printed silk that's pleated, and I think she wore it for bridge or something, a game, and it's very lovely. It's very subdued. It's navy and green. And it has a actually really beautiful belt that's navy and green with two leather things put together absolutely perfectly. And it's striped and the pockets match perfectly. And but in the skirt, it's a pleated skirt, and like that dress, this pleated skirt thing, and then it just opens and you see the polka dots that are printed in that. So again, this is, working with the textile manufacturer Marc Bohan, who worked for years with Dior in Dior London and before in Paris, and then of course he became the head designer after Saint Laurent. And was, the person who had the relationship with Grace of Monaco. He understood all those things. I mean, he really, really understood all the tropes of the house. And, just to make that so it's only when you walk that you see that. And it's so subtle. And that's, again, one of those dresses that I don't think you make money on. But the textile manufacturer is truly happy. And they did a brilliant thing with it. But it's, so these kind of, the traces, they call them in France, the traces of the house, and everything that Dior did in the first 10 years, you can see it in all the designs, so many of the designs, even through to today. I mean, it's really amazing. And the house has an archive that's amazing. And they've just opened another Dior museum in Paris, and they look very closely at all that stuff, and they're very, very aware of it, and they use everything they have, but a little piece of jewelry, all the tropes are there, and it's I've seen a few Dior handbags here too. Those are the keys of the house that have made it so successful that they keep working on, and you can see that in your lovely exhibition here.
Thank you very much. I am planning on sneaking into the Adirondack building tomorrow to look at that dress with a little bit more attention to detail. And I hope that those of you who are here at Hillwood or joining us from home come and visit soon to do the same. As Kate mentioned earlier this evening, Alexandra will be signing copies of her book just outside the doors to the theater, and we hope to see you all on Zoom next week. Thanks so much.
Thank you.